June 24th, 1314. In 4 hours, 10,000 Scottish farmers with spears will do something that should be impossible. They'll completely destroy the largest English army ever assembled and change the fate of 2 kingdoms forever. But first, watch how a hunted outlaw hiding in a cave became the king who turned defeat into the greatest military upset in medieval history. To understand how this miracle happened, you need to meet the man who refused to let Scotland die. Robert the Bruce had once been everything the English loved about Scottish nobility, a Norman lord with lands on both sides of the border, sworn to serve English kings. He lived in luxury, dining with English nobles, speaking French at court, completely removed from the struggles of common Scots. But in 1306, he murdered his rival in a church, declared himself King of Scotland, and became the most wanted man in Britain. The murder of John Comyn wasn't planned. It happened during a heated argument at Greyfriars Church in Dumfries. Bruce had gone to meet Comyn, hoping to gain his support for the rebellion. Instead, tempers flared, daggers were drawn, and when the blood stopped flowing, Bruce had committed sacrilege and treason in a single moment. There was no going back. He could either claim the throne or die as an outlaw. What followed was 7 years of hell. Bruce wasn't just fighting the English, he was fighting to survive. His coronation was a pathetic affair, attended by a handful of supporters in a half-empty church. Within months, he had lost 3 battles and watched his brothers captured and executed. His wife and daughter were imprisoned in English castles. His strategy was brutal but brilliant. Burn his own castles so enemies couldn't use them. Strike fast and vanish. Never give them a target they could destroy. He became a ghost, haunting the Scottish countryside, appearing from nowhere to strike English garrisons, then melting back into the wilderness before reinforcements could arrive. His men learned to travel light, live off the land, and trust no one outside their inner circle. They slept in different places every night, never stayed anywhere long enough to be trapped, and left burned ruins wherever the English tried to establish control. But during his darkest hour, hiding in a cave with only a handful of followers, Bruce watched a spider try again and again to spin its web. He had just suffered another crushing defeat. Half his men were dead or scattered. Those who remained were talking of surrender, of fleeing to Ireland or France. Bruce himself was wounded, exhausted, and beginning to wonder if God had truly abandoned his cause. 6 times the spider fell as it tried to anchor its web to the cave ceiling. Bruce watched, transfixed, seeing his own failures reflected in the tiny creature's struggle. On the 7th attempt, it succeeded. The moment was transformative. If a spider could persist against impossible odds, refusing to accept defeat, even when everything seemed hopeless, so could the King of Scots. Bruce rose from his makeshift bed, gathered his remaining followers, and spoke words that would echo through Scottish history. "We have been beaten, but we are not broken. We have been scattered, but we are not destroyed. Tomorrow, we begin again." But what Bruce learned next would change everything. The enemy marching north to crush him wasn't just any English king. This was Edward II, son of the most feared warrior in Europe, Edward Longshanks, the Hammer of the Scots. Edward I had been a giant among medieval kings, 6 feet tall in an age when most men barely reached 5.5 feet. With the physical presence and tactical brilliance that had made England the terror of Europe. He had conquered Wales, humiliated Scotland, and died still marching north to complete his dream of ruling all Britain. When Longshanks died still trying to conquer Scotland, he left his son a simple command: finish the job. Edward II was weak and indecisive, more interested in his male favourites than warfare, but he had something his father never possessed: unlimited resources, and a burning need to prove himself worthy of the Plantagenet name. The nobles whispered that he was unfit to rule, that he lacked his father's warrior instincts. The criticism stung, and Scotland offered him a chance to silence his critics forever. In spring 1314, he assembled the largest army in living memory, nearly 20,000 men, over 2,000 knights in full armour, each one a professional warrior trained from childhood to fight from horseback. These weren't weekend soldiers or feudal levies, they were career killers whose entire lives revolved around war. Behind them marched thousands of Welsh longbowmen, men whose arrows could punch through mail at 200 yards and kill a horse at 300. Professional soldiers who had never known defeat, backed by a supply train that stretched for miles and carried everything from siege engines to mobile forges. The wealth on display was staggering. A single knight's equipment horse, armour, weapons, cost more than a Scottish farmer would see in 10 lifetimes. The English army's daily expenses exceeded the annual income of most Scottish nobles. This wasn't just military superiority, it was a demonstration of economic power that should have made resistance seem futile. But there was something Edward didn't know about the man waiting for him. Bruce had spent 7 years learning exactly how to kill English armies. Every defeat had been a lesson, every retreat a chance to study his enemy's weaknesses. He'd discovered that heavy cavalry, for all their power, were vulnerable in the right terrain. He'd learned that professional soldiers, confident in their superiority, could be psychologically shattered if that superiority was suddenly called into question. Most importantly, he'd realized that you don't have to win every battle, you just have to refuse to lose the war. His guerrilla campaign had been a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. While English armies lumbered across the countryside, weighed down by their supply trains and siege equipment, Bruce's forces moved like wolves, striking isolated garrisons and vanishing before help could arrive. He had turned Scotland into a nightmare for occupying forces. Every castle they garrisoned was burned when they left. Every collaboration they purchased was undone the moment their backs were turned. By 1314, he controlled most of Scotland through pure guerrilla genius. English forces were confined to their strongest fortresses, afraid to venture far from their walls. The countryside belonged to Bruce and the growing number of Scots who had rallied to his banner. But now he faced a problem no amount of hit-and-run tactics could solve. The English were marching on Stirling Castle, perched on its volcanic rock, commanding the gateway between the Scottish Highlands and Lowlands. The fortress was the key to Scotland control Stirling, and you controlled the main route north. Its garrison, commanded by Sir Philip Mowbray, had agreed to surrender if no relief came by midsummer. The English army was assured that no relief would ever arrive. For the first time in 7 years, Bruce would have to risk everything in the kind of pitched battle he'd spent years avoiding. It was exactly the fight that could destroy him forever. The one scenario where all his advantages, speed, local knowledge, surprise, would count for nothing against raw military superiority. But Bruce had a secret weapon the English never saw coming. If you're gripped by this incredible underdog story, smash that subscribe button now, because what happens next will blow your mind. The two armies that met near Stirling couldn't have been more different. Edward's force was a monument to medieval military power. Thousands of knights in steel armor, riding massive war horses bred specifically for war. Each destrier was worth a fortune, standing over 6 feet at the shoulder, trained to strike with its hooves and bite with its teeth. The knights who rode them were walking arsenals, carrying 12-foot lances, longswords, war hammers, and daggers, protected by steel plate that could turn aside most weapons. Behind the cavalry stood ranks of professional infantry, English men-at-arms, with sword and spear, seasoned veterans of campaigns in Wales and France. But the real terror was the Welsh longbowmen, nearly 5,000 of them, each capable of losing 12 arrows per minute with deadly accuracy. Their 6-foot yew bows could drive a bodkin point through mail and padding, and in massed volleys they could darken the sky with death. This was an army built to conquer nations, equipped with the finest weapons and armor money could buy, led by nobles who had never known defeat. The English had crushed every enemy they had faced for generations. Their very presence on a battlefield was usually enough to send opposing forces running. Bruce had barely 10,000 men, farmers with spears, craftsmen with axes, men carrying whatever weapons they could forge or steal. Most had never seen a real battle, let alone fought in one. Their armor was leather or mail if they were lucky, more often just padded jackets that would stop a glancing blow but little else. Many carried weapons their grandfathers had used, rusty swords, woodsmen's axes, hunting spears hastily fitted with longer shafts. The contrast was stark enough to be almost comical. English knights whose armor cost more than entire Scottish villages faced farmers whose entire military kit might be worth a few shillings. Professional warriors who had trained for decades confronted men who had learned to fight in the past few months. But Bruce had advantages that numbers couldn't measure, and he was about to use every single one. The Scottish king chose his battlefield like a chess master, understanding that terrain could multiply force far beyond what numbers suggested. The ground near Bannockburn was deceptively treacherous, firm-looking grass, concealing soft, marshy earth that would turn into a death trap for heavy cavalry. Bruce had scouted every inch personally, walking the field at different times of day, in different weather, understanding exactly how the ground would behave under the weight of charging horses. More crucially, Bruce had spent years developing tactics specifically designed to neutralize English advantages. His schiltron formations turned spearmen into living fortresses, bristling walls of steel that no horse would charge. The concept wasn't new. Swiss pikemen had used similar tactics, but Bruce had refined it for Scottish conditions, training his men to move as one organism, presenting an impenetrable hedge of spear points. Each schiltron contained roughly 1,500 men, arranged in a tight square, the front ranks kneeling with spears braced against the ground, the rear ranks standing with spears angled forward over their comrades' heads. The formation created a wall of steel points extending 12 feet in every direction, impossible for cavalry to penetrate, and difficult for infantry to break. Bruce had drilled his men relentlessly in these formations, teaching farmers to move and think like professional soldiers. They learned to advance in perfect step, maintaining their bristling wall even while marching. They practiced forming up quickly from loose order, turning confused peasants into disciplined soldiers in moments. But first, something happened that shocked both armies to their core. On June 23rd, the English vanguard arrived within sight of the Scottish positions. The sight should have been terrifying for the Scots' thousands of knights in glittering armor, their colorful banners snapping in the breeze, their horses prancing with barely contained energy. The English were eager for battle, confident that tomorrow would bring an easy victory and rich rewards. Among the English knights was Sir Henry de Bohun, a young nobleman hungry for glory. De Bohun came from one of England's most distinguished military families. His relatives had fought at Hastings, in the Crusades, and in every major English victory for generations. This was his chance to win fame that would echo through history. As the English cavalry moved into position, de Bohun spotted a figure he recognized riding ahead of the Scottish lines. It was Robert the Bruce himself, mounted on a small grey palfrey rather than a war horse, wearing simple mail instead of plate armor, carrying nothing but a battle-axe. To de Bohun, it must have seemed like divine providence, the chance to end the entire rebellion with a single lance thrust. Seeing his chance for immortal glory, de Bohun spurred his massive war-horse and charged directly at the Scottish king with a levelled lance. His destrier thundered across the ground, each hoofbeat like a hammer blow, the 12-foot ash spear aimed straight at Bruce's chest. Around him, knights from both armies stopped what they were doing to watch. This was single combat between champions, the kind of moment that decided battles and made legends. Bruce could have retreated back to his lines. He could have called for support. Dozens of Scottish spears would have made quick work of a single knight. His nobles would later criticize him for taking such a risk, pointing out that his death would have ended Scottish resistance forever. Instead, he did something that changed everything and revealed the warrior's heart that beat beneath his royal titles. At the last moment, as de Bohun's lance point was about to strike home, Bruce wheeled his small horse aside with expert horsemanship. The English lance missed by inches, throwing de Bohun off balance in his saddle. Before the young knight could recover, Bruce rose in his stirrups and brought his battle-axe down with devastating force, using his horse's momentum to multiply the blow's power. The axe bit through de Bohun's great helm as if it were paper, splitting both steel and skull with a sound that echoed across the battlefield. The young knight, weighed down by 60 pounds of armor, crashed to the ground as his riderless horse galloped away. Blood pooled in the grass around his shattered helmet. The English army watched in stunned silence as their champion lay dead in the dirt, killed by a rebel they had dismissed as an outlaw pretender. The psychological impact was enormous. If their king could kill an English knight in single combat, perhaps he truly was worthy of the crown he claimed. The Scots erupted in wild cheering, their voices echoing across the field like thunder. In a single moment, Bruce had transformed from desperate rebel into warrior king, proving he feared no English knight, no matter how heavily armed or nobly born. The axe handle had split from the force of the blow, and Bruce's nobles worried he had risked everything for a moment's glory. But Bruce understood what they didn't. This wasn't about tactics or strategy. This was about proving that the King of Scots feared no man alive. But this was just the beginning. Dawn on June 24th rose grey and misty over Bannockburn, the air thick with summer humidity and the tension of 30,000 men preparing for battle. Both armies had spent a restless night, knowing that daylight would bring a reckoning that would decide the fate of Scotland. The English formed up in their traditional order, the same formation that had brought them victory after victory for generations. Heavy cavalry in front, ready to smash through enemy lines with the devastating shock of their charge. Behind them, ranks of infantry stood ready to exploit any breakthrough. On the flanks, Welsh longbowmen prepared their arrows, each man carrying a sheaf of 24 bodkin points, capable of punching through the finest armor. Their confidence was infectious. These men had never lost a major battle. They represented the military might of the wealthiest kingdom in Europe, backed by resources that seemed unlimited. Many were already discussing how they would divide Scotland's lands once victory was won. The rebellion would end today, and they would all be richer for it. But Bruce was about to prove that sometimes the old ways don't work. The Scottish king had arranged his forces in 4 compact schiltrons, each one a fortress of spear points that could advance or defend as needed. Behind them, he held a small reserve of mounted men-at-arms, his only cavalry force, positioned to exploit any opportunity that arose. It was a defensive formation, but one capable of aggressive movement when the moment was right. Bruce moved among his men in the grey dawn light, sharing their fears and hopes, reminding them what they fought for. These weren't professional soldiers, motivated by pay or plunder. They were fighting for their homes, their families, their right to call themselves free men. That difference in motivation would prove crucial in the hours to come. The English cavalry began their magnificent charge across the marshy ground. Hundreds of armoured knights thundering forward with levelled lances, the flower of English chivalry riding to what seemed certain victory. The ground trembled under thousands of hoofbeats. The sight should have been terrifying, an avalanche of steel and horseflesh that nothing could stop. Instead, something impossible happened. The soft ground that looked solid from a distance began revealing its true nature as the massive war horses struck it at full gallop. What had appeared to be firm turf was actually marsh grass, growing over boggy soil, treacherous footing that could barely support a man's weight, let alone a destrier in full armor. The perfect cavalry charge, the tactical maneuver that had dominated European battlefields for centuries, began to fall apart as horses struggled through mud that clung to their legs like quicksand. Knights found themselves trapped, unable to maneuver, their horses exhausted by the effort of pulling their hooves free with every step. What should have been an irresistible shock assault became a confused nightmare as the English cavalry lost all cohesion. Individual knights struggled forward, but the devastating collective impact of the charge was lost in the marsh. The schiltrons held. Where English lances struck home, Scottish spearmen died, but the formations didn't break. Bruce had trained his men well. They knew that their survival depended on maintaining the bristling wall of spear points that kept the cavalry at bay. The long spears, braced against the ground and angled forward, created a barrier no horse would willingly charge. Knights in heavy armor found themselves dismounted and helpless, easy prey for Scottish axes and swords. Their expensive equipment, designed to dominate on firm ground, became a liability in the sucking mud. Many drowned in their own armor, too heavy to rise once they fell. But the English had one more deadly card to play. Welsh longbowmen began raining arrows into Scottish formations, their bodkin points seeking gaps in armor and shield walls. For a terrifying moment, it looked like the schiltrons might break under the deadly hail. The arrows came in clouds, darkening the sky, striking with enough force to punch through mail and padding. Scottish soldiers began falling, struck down by arrows they never saw coming. The neat formations started to waver as men sought cover that didn't exist. This was the moment that should have decided the battle, the combination of cavalry pressure and archery that had crushed every enemy England had faced. Bruce had anticipated this exact threat. While the English focused on his spearmen, he had positioned a force of light Scottish cavalry under Sir Robert Keith, specifically to deal with the archers. As the Welsh bowmen concentrated on the schiltrons, Keith's horsemen struck them from the side like a thunderbolt. The archers, unarmored and focused on their targets, were helpless against mounted men-at-arms. They scattered in panic, abandoning their bows as they fled. In minutes, the weapon that should have broken the Scottish formations was neutralized, leaving the English with nothing but their trapped and exhausted cavalry. Now the tide truly began to turn, but what happened next defied all military logic. The English cavalry, trapped in marsh and unable to break the schiltrons, started retreating. But retreat in heavy armor, across soft ground, proved nearly impossible. Knights who had charged forward in perfect formation now struggled back individually, their horses blown and exhausted, their armor weighing them down like anchors. What began as an organized withdrawal quickly became something much more dangerous. Panic, that most contagious of battlefield emotions, began to spread through English ranks like wildfire. Individual retreats became group flight, as more and more knights realized their situation was hopeless. Bruce, watching from his position with the reserve, recognized the moment every general dreams of the instant when victory becomes possible. His enemy was trapped, disordered, and beginning to panic. This was his chance, and he seized it with both hands. Bruce, seeing his moment, ordered his reserves forward. Fresh Scottish spearmen pushed ahead, their formations intact, their morale soaring as they saw their enemy's desperation. The schiltrons that had stood defensive all morning suddenly became aggressive, pushing forward like moving fortresses. Adding to the chaos, Scottish camp followers, servants, grooms, and other non-combatants appeared on a nearby hill. The English, already shaken and confused, mistook them for fresh Scottish reinforcements arriving at the worst possible moment. The psychological impact was devastating. What had been a retreat became a full rout as panic consumed the English army. Nobles who had come north expecting easy victory now fought desperately just to escape alive. The largest army in British history was dissolving into chaos. Edward II, watching his magnificent army disintegrate before his eyes, made the most humiliating decision of his reign. Rather than die fighting like his warrior father, he fled the battlefield, abandoning his army and his honor. The King of England, who had come north with dreams of conquest, was now running for his life with a handful of bodyguards. The route was complete. English knights threw away their expensive armor to escape faster, discarding fortunes in equipment to gain precious speed. Nobles who expected to divide Scotland among themselves now drowned in streams, weighed down by armor they couldn't remove quickly enough. The Scots pursued relentlessly, taking prisoner after prisoner, capturing the baggage train with its enormous wealth, and seizing enough weapons and armor to equip several armies. The field was littered with the flower of English chivalry, dead or dying in the mud they had thought to trample under their horses' hooves. Want to see more incredible upsets that changed history? Share this video and tell us in the comments what impossible victory you want covered next. Stirling Castle surrendered immediately, its English garrison opening the gates the moment they saw their relief army scattered to the winds. But the victory at Bannockburn was more than just a military triumph. It was a transformation that changed the nature of medieval warfare and the balance of power in Britain forever. More importantly, Bruce had transformed from outlaw to legitimate King of Scotland. The man who had murdered his rival in a church 8 years earlier was now the victor of the greatest military upset in Scottish history. He had proven that with clever tactics, careful preparation, and unbreakable will, even a small army could defeat a much larger one. The victory shattered the myth of English invincibility that had dominated European politics for decades. Lords who had collaborated with English occupation switched sides overnight. Castles that seemed impregnable suddenly found their English garrisons surrounded and besieged by Scots who no longer feared their former masters. The Battle of Bannockburn proved that victory belongs not to the largest army, but to the one with the strongest heart and smartest strategy. Robert the Bruce had done more than win a battle. He had forged a nation from farmers with spears and an unshakable belief that freedom was worth any sacrifice. The spider had finally completed its web. If stories like this fire you up, smash that subscribe button and notification bell to join our community of history lovers. What legendary battle should we cover next? Let us know in the comments, and share this with anyone who loves tales of courage against impossible odds.